The terrible crime at Richmond at last on Catherine Webster now has been cast. Tried and found guilty, she is sentenced to die. From the strong hand of justice she cannot fly. She has tried all excuses, but of no avail. About this and murder she's told many tales. She has tried to throw blame on others as well. But with all her cunning, at last she has fell.
Kate Webster has passed into history as one of the most universally despised criminals. She was born Catherine Lawler in Killane, County Wexford, Ireland, in 1849, of poor but respectable parents. As a small child, she was caught stealing on numerous occasions and developed an unenviable reputation for dishonesty. In her teens, she stole some money and used it to go by ship to Liverpool. She spent the next few years living on her wits and what she could steal. She tried picking pockets, but was particularly bad at it and was sent to prison for 4 years as a result at the age of 15. The details of Webster's early life are unclear, as many of her later autobiographical statements proved unreliable. But she claimed to have been married to a sea captain called Webster, by whom she had 4 children. According to Webster's account, all the children died, as did her husband, within a short time of each other. Whether this is true is doubtful. When she was released at the age of 18, Kate travelled to London in 1867 and took a job as a cleaner, often literally cleaning out her employer's possessions before moving on. She also made a little extra money as a prostitute. It was not too long before she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. Even this failed to reform her, and she took to robbing boarding houses. She would take a room, sell everything that she could lay her hands on before absconding. The next few years saw her being arrested on innumerable occasions and receiving short prison sentences. On release, she moved to Rose Gardens in Hammersmith, West London, where she became friends with a neighbouring family called Porter. On the 18th of April 1874, she gave birth to a son, whom she named John Webster. The identity of the father is unclear, as she named 3 different men at various times. One, a man named Strong, was her accomplice in further robberies and thefts. She later claimed to have been forced into crime, as she had been forsaken by him and committed crimes for the purpose of supporting herself and child. Webster moved frequently around West London, using various aliases, including Webb, Webster, Gibbs, Gibbons, and Lawler. While living in Teddington, she was arrested and convicted in May 1875 of 36 charges of theft. She was sentenced to 18 months in Wandsworth Prison. Not longer after her release, she was arrested again for robbery and was sentenced to another 12 months' imprisonment in February 1877. Her young son was cared for in her absence by Sarah Crease, a friend who worked as a domestic servant for a Miss Loder in Richmond. In January 1879, Crease fell ill, and Webster stood in for her as a temporary replacement at Loder's house. Loder knew Julia Thomas as a friend, and was aware of her wish to find a domestic servant. She recommended Webster on the basis of the latter's temporary work for her. When Thomas met Webster, she engaged her on the spot, though she did not appear to have made any inquiries about Webster's character or past. Mrs. Thomas lived at No. 2 Mayfield Cottages, Park Road, Richmond. She was a former schoolteacher who had been widowed twice. Since the death of her second husband in 1873, she had lived on her own. The house was a 2-storey semi-detached villa, built in grey stone with a garden at the front and back. The area was not heavily populated at the time, although our house was close to a pub called the Hole in the Wall. Thomas was described as a small, well-dressed lady with an excitable temperament, and neighbours thought that she was a bit eccentric, and she was about 54 years old with an excitable temperament. She frequently travelled, leaving her friends and relatives unaware of her whereabouts for weeks or months at a time. She was not wealthy, but had a comfortable lifestyle and habitually dressed well and wore jewellery to give the impression of prosperity. Her desire to employ a live-in domestic servant probably had as much to do with status as with practicality. But she had a reputation for being a harsh employer, and her irregular habits meant that she had difficulty finding and retaining servants. On the 29th of January 1879, Thomas took on Kate Webster as her servant. Initially it worked out well, but soon Kate fell back into her old habits of spending more time in the local pubs than at work. The relationship between the two women seems to have deteriorated rapidly, and on Sunday the 2nd of March, after having had the job for only 1 month, Kate Webster was sacked by Thomas due to the dislike of the quality of her work and having criticised it regularly. Mrs. Thomas went off to church, with Webster's abusive language still ringing in her ears. When she returned from the service, she went upstairs to her bedroom. As she was removing her hat, Webster, wielding an axe, burst into the room and struck the old lady a glancing blow on the head. Mrs. Thomas managed to struggle out onto the landing, where Webster pushed her down the stairs. The assailant rushed after her and smashed the woman's head in with the axe. In a later confession, Webster stated that her employer had returned to the house that day and went upstairs. "I went up after her," she said. "We had an argument, which ripened into a quarrel, and in the height of my anger and rage, I threw her from the top of the stairs to the ground floor. She had a heavy fall, and I became agitated at what had occurred, lost all control of myself, and, to prevent her screaming and getting me into trouble, I caught her by the throat, and in the struggle she was choked, and I threw her on the floor." The neighbours had heard a single thump like that of a chair falling over, but paid no heed to it at the time. Meanwhile, Webster began disposing of the body by dismembering it and boiling it in the laundry copper and burning the bones in the hearth. She later described those actions. "I deemed to do away with the body as best I could," she said. "I chopped the head from the body with the assistance of a razor, which I used to cut through the flesh afterwards. I also used the meat saw and the carving knife to cut the body up with. I prepared the copper with water to boil the body to prevent identity, and as soon as I had succeeded in cutting it up, I placed it in the copper and boiled it. I opened the stomach with the carving knife and burned up as much of the parts as I could." Weary from her exertions, she left the mixture to simmer for an hour while she went to the pub for some refreshment. On her return, Webster packed up the remains in a box and placed the whole lot inside cloth bags lined with thick brown paper. She then set about cleaning the kitchen and hallway. The following day she made up a fire in the kitchen and fed in Mrs. Thomas's bones. Next, she visited the pawnbrokers, where she pledged Mrs. Thomas's gold bridgework for 6 shillings. This success deserved a drink or two, and she retired to the pub and got drunk. While there, she tried to sell some jars of best lard, which was really the reduced body fat of Mrs. Thomas. It was said that Webster had also offered the fat to neighbours and even street children. The neighbours noticed an unusual and unpleasant smell. Webster spoke later of how she was greatly overcome, both from the horrible sight before her and the smell. All the activity at Mayfield Cottages did not seem to be out of the ordinary, as it was customary in many households for the washing to begin early on a Monday morning. Over the next couple of days, Webster continued cleaning the house and wore Thomas's clothes to put on a show of normality for people who called for orders. Behind the scenes, she was packing the dismembered remains into a black Gladstone bag and a corded wooden bonnet box. She was unable to fit the murdered woman's head and one of the feet into the containers and dispose of them separately, throwing the foot onto a rubbish heap in Twickenham. The head was buried under the hole-in-the-walls pub stables, a short distance from the house. Now calling herself Mrs. Thomas, she set about selling off the furniture. She asked a family that she knew, the Porters, and they suggested that a man named John Church might be interested. Webster, Henry Porter, and his son Robert set out to visit Church. They made their way home by way of several local pubs. In one of these, near to Hammersmith Bridge, Webster excused herself and left carrying a large black bag. A short time later she returned, without the bag. She next got Robert Porter to help her carry a large wooden box. When they got to Richmond Bridge, she told the lad to leave her and that she would catch him up in a few minutes. As he left the bridge, he heard the sound of a large splash. A couple of minutes later, Webster appeared out of the fog and said, "Well, that's over." The next day, the box was found washed up in shallow water, next to the riverbank about 5 miles downstream. It was spotted by Henry Wheatley, a coal porter who was driving his cart past Barnes Railway Bridge shortly before 7 in the morning. He initially thought that the box might contain the proceeds of a burglary. He recovered the box and opened it, finding that it contained what looked like body parts wrapped in brown paper. The discovery was immediately reported to the police, and the remains were examined by a doctor, who found that they consisted of the abdomen, minus the entrails, and legs, minus 1 foot, of a woman. The head was missing, and was later assumed to have been thrown into the river separately by Webster. Around the same time, a human foot and ankle were found in Twickenham. It was clear that all of the remains belonged to the same corpse, but there was nothing to connect them with Mrs. Thomas, and no means to identify the remains. The doctor who examined the body parts erroneously attributed them to a young person with very dark hair. An inquest held on the 10th of March resulted in an open verdict on the cause of death, and the unidentified remains were laid to rest in Barnes Cemetery a week later. Webster continued to live at Mayfield Cottages while posing as Thomas, wearing her late employer's clothes and dealing with tradesmen under her newly assumed identity. On the 9th of March, she reached an agreement with John Church from Hammersmith to sell Thomas's furniture and other goods to furnish his pub, the Rising Sun. He agreed to pay her £68, with an interim payment of £18 in advance. By the time the removal horse and cart arrived on the 18th of March, the neighbours were becoming increasingly suspicious, as they had not seen Mrs. Thomas for nearly 2 weeks. Her next-door neighbour, Miss Ives, asked the men who had ordered the goods removed. They replied Mrs. Thomas, and indicated to Webster. The police were called. Realizing she had been exposed, Webster fled out of the back of the house immediately and caught a train to Liverpool and travelled from there to her family home at Enniscorthy in Ireland. Meanwhile, Church realised that he had been deceived. When he went through clothes left in the house, he found a letter addressed to the real Mrs. Thomas. The police were called in and searched number 2 Mayfield cottages. There they discovered bloodstains, burned finger bones in the hearth, and fatty deposits behind the copper, as well as a letter left by Webster giving her home address in Ireland. They immediately put out a wanted notice giving a description of Webster and her son. Detectives from Scotland Yard soon discovered that Webster and her son had fled back to Ireland aboard a coal steamer. The chief constable of the Royal Irish Constabulary in Wexford realised the woman being sought by Scotland Yard was the same person his force had arrested years previously for stealing. They were able to trace Webster to her uncle's farm in Killane near Enniscorthy and arrested her there. She was still wearing Mrs. Thomas's clothes and jewellery as she was returned to London into the custody of Scotland Yard and charged with murder. Webster went on trial at the Central Criminal Court at the Old Bailey on the 2nd of July 1879. In a sign of the great public interest surrounding the case, the prosecution was led by the Solicitor General, Sir Harding Giffard. Webster was defended by a prominent London barrister, Warner Slay, and the case was presided over by Mr. Justice Denman. Over the course of 6 days, the court heard a succession of witnesses piecing together the complicated story of how Thomas had met her death. Webster had attempted before the trial to implicate John Church and her former neighbour Porter, but both men had solid alibis and were cleared of any involvement in the murder. She pleaded not guilty, and her defence sought to emphasise the circumstantial nature of the evidence, highlighting her devotion to her son as a reason why she could not be capable of the murder. Webster's public unpopularity, impassive demeanour, and scanty defence counted strongly against her. She was characterised as malicious, reckless, and wilfully evil. The court saw her crime as both gruesome and scandalous. A particularly damning piece of evidence came from a bonnet maker named Maria Durden, who told the court that Webster had visited her a week before the murder and had said that she was going to Birmingham to sell some property, jewellery, and a house that her aunt had left her. The jury interpreted this as a sign that Webster had premeditated the murder and convicted her after deliberating for about an hour and a quarter. Shortly after the jury returned its verdict of guilty, and just before the judge was about to pass sentence, Webster was asked if there was any reason why sentence of death should not be passed upon her. She pleaded that she was pregnant in an apparent bid to avoid the death penalty. The judge commented later that after 32 years in the profession, he had never heard an inquiry of this sort. Eventually, the clerk of the assizes suggested using the archaic mechanism of a jury of matrons, constituted from a selection of the women attending the court, to rule upon the question of whether Webster was indeed pregnant. 12 women were sworn in, along with a surgeon named Bond, and they accompanied Webster to a private room for an examination that only took a couple of minutes. They retained a verdict that Webster was not with child, though this did not necessarily mean that she was not pregnant, a distinction that led to the President of the Obstetrical Society of London to protest at the use of the obsolete medical assumption that the unborn child is not alive until the birth. Before she was executed, Webster made 2 statements confessing to the crime. In her first, she implicated Strong, the purported father of her child, who she said had participated in the murder and was responsible for leading her into a life of crime. She recanted this on the 28th of July, the night before she was due to be executed, making a further statement in which she took sole responsibility and exonerated Church, Porter and Strong of any involvement. She was executed the following day at Wandsworth Prison at 9 a.m, where the hangman, William Marwood, used his newly developed long drop technique to cause instantaneous death. After her execution was certified, she was buried in an unmarked grave in one of the prison's exercise yards. The crowd waiting outside cheered as a black flag was raised over the prison walls, signifying that the death sentence had been carried out. An auction of Thomas's property was held at 2 Mayfield cottages on the day after Webster's execution. Church managed to obtain Thomas's furniture after all, along with numerous other personal effects, including her pocket watch and the knife with which she had been dismembered. The copper in which the body had been boiled was sold for 5 shillings. Other visitors contented themselves with taking small pebbles and twigs from the garden as souvenirs. The house itself remained unoccupied until 1897, as nobody would live there after the murder. Even then, according to the occupant, servants were reluctant to work at such a notorious place. In 1952, the naturalist and broadcaster Sir David Attenborough and his wife Jane bought a house situated between the former Mayfield cottages, which still stand today, and the Hole-in-the-Wall pub, which closed in 2007 and fell into dereliction, but was bought by the Attenboroughs in 2009 to be redeveloped. On the 22nd of October 2010, workmen carrying out excavation work on the rear of the building uncovered a dark circular object which turned out to be a woman's skull. It had been buried underneath foundations that had been in place for at least 40 years, on the site of the pub's stables. It was immediately speculated that the skull was Thomas's, and the coroner asked the local police to carry out an investigation into the identity and circumstances of death of the skull's owner. Carbon dating carried out at the University of Edinburgh dated the skull to between 1650 and 1880, while the fact that it had been deposited on top of a layer of Victorian tiles suggested that it belonged to the end of this era. The skull had fracture marks consistent with Webster's account of throwing Mrs. Thomas down the stairs, and it was found to have low collagen levels, consistent with it being boiled. In July 2011, the coroner concluded that the skull was indeed that of Julia Thomas. DNA testing was not possible, as she had died childless, and no relatives could be traced. In addition, there was no record of where exactly in Barnes Cemetery the rest of her body had been buried. The coroner recorded a verdict of unlawful killing, superseding the verdict recorded in 1879. The cause of Thomas's death was given as asphyxiation and a head injury. The police called the outcome a good example of how good old-fashioned detective work, historical records, and technological advances came together to solve the mystery.